The mandatory risk disclosure landscape, as you know, is evolving at the international level as well as individually across countries. I mean, the climate risks are so profound that countries can't ignore them. At the international level, you're seeing a lot of coalescing around standardization happening, and one of the first times it did happen was during COP26 with the launch of the International Sustainability Standards Board, or as everyone calls it, ISSB. A lot of industry-based disclosure standards all consolidated to come under one umbrella. And since then, ISSB has launched a climate disclosure framework along with a sustainability framework, and it's also preparing to launch other frameworks at the country level. Governments are also drafting rules, laws, regulations, whatever you call them, and they're acting as monitor, enforcer, standard setter. Countries such as the EU, the UK, in the ASEAN region, you have Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam. China's considering disclosures, as well as Japan, India, and Israel are also contemplating these. And I think right now, obviously, as you know, in the US, the Biden administration has put climate as a top priority in its agenda. So different government agencies are preparing different rules on climate, and Brazil is also considering this. With respect to stakeholders, I think stakeholders have a big role to play here. And before I get into that, I think one thing to mention is that by stakeholders, we mean a bunch of different actors across the ecosystem. So it's not only frontline communities or workers, it's also investors, it's also suppliers, it's also, government is also, for example, a stakeholder. But stakeholders have a role to play as an amplifier, we believe, an advocate, a connector, and a thought leader. And as amplifiers and advocates, they push for mandatory disclosure regimes that are robust. They push for holding companies account to these, and they can also push and encourage countries to develop disclosures that are aligned with each other and with international standards. As a connector, they can connect those stakeholders, some stakeholders on the ground, with decision makers in the global arena, bringing the voices of those that are unheard. As a thought leader, they have the expertise to really contribute to this conversation, especially, hearing impacts on the ground or valuable expertise on technical subjects. One of the things that we believe that is important for us as a rights-based organization is to consider the voice of all stakeholders, because it's not only like, for example, in the case of the SEC, yes, investors are the priority, market participants are the priority, but it's also frontline communities, it's also workers, it's also suppliers. So we believe that the whole gamut of these should be included in there. Another aspect that we consider is when talking about transition, just transition is an important theme there. I mean, as you're noticing across the board, just transition is moving into the mainstream. So that's an important requirement for us. And then another thing we think is that widespread applicability, that it shouldn't be certain industries only, but it should be companies across the board. Other aspects that we think that could be important to include is also considering that market participants and companies do not have an outsized role here to play. Obviously, considering that it's in their vested interest to sort of skirt as much disclosure or not report as much as possible. So definitely balancing out the different stakeholders across the spectrum in terms of how much of a role that they play. And then the other aspects I think that are going to be important is that, there should be left very little room for ambiguity, because as we've seen, especially in the US and, when the EPA was challenged by the state of West Virginia, the court actually sided with West Virginia, saying that, using the major questions doctrine as a rule. So, for example, they should be considering like how much of it do they leave open for interpretation. And one of the big things that we are pushing for at the SEC, for example, is that certain sectors, especially carbon-intensive sectors, need to have sector-specific disclosures. And this is not only fossil fuels or oil and gas. We see this in steel, food and beverage, agriculture. The risk of stranded assets is also a big issue in these sectors. So definitely that should be a priority for them. I think at the SEC, how they're doing this is through independent audits and reasonable assurance. They should be consistent and comparable. We definitely want them to be compared, not only companies to be able to be compared not only within a sector, but also across industries. And as much as possible, that they should be aligned with other international standards, for example, like the ISSB. If I were to think of a government or a region that has done it well, I think amongst the players, looking at the EU's corporate sustainability reporting disclosure requirements, I mean, there are certain aspects of this that I think they've done it well, and some of them being that they've gone beyond the TCFD disclosure, which is an industry-based standard, which we really like. The fact that they've done that. Second is the breadth of companies that they include. I think it's about almost 50,000 companies at least operating within the region. But it not only that, it also includes companies that have sizable business operations in the EU that have to also report, but are headquartered abroad. What we like about this disclosure is also the social dimensions that it takes on. It's not only about the environmental taxonomy that is developed, but also social in terms of impacts to communities, to workers, to users, to consumers. And the other thing is the focus on double materiality, which is a concept is not only looking at the environment and the impacts to the company, but also the company's impacts on the environment, which I think is big. And lastly, I think what we like about the EU is in terms of compliance and the imposition of fines in case of non-compliance. Other countries, I have to also mention some aspects of the SEC's proposed rule that we're hoping should come out any day. One of the things we like about that is the value chain approach that it takes. So it looks at companies' operations not only, within, but it also looks at upstream and downstream commitments and impacts. It basically also asks companies to file information versus furnish. And over there, the basic difference is that when they file that information, it has a higher legal standard, so there's less likelihood of misrepresentation or omission of facts. And then what we really like about it is that, it's asks for emissions in gross terms, so it takes into consideration offsets. And, as a rights-based organization, as I've mentioned, we've seen the impacts of offsets, not only on the environment, but also on communities. And so we like the fact that, companies have less scope for greenwashing when they have to report this on gross terms. When I'm talking about risks here, I'm talking about the risks, emanating from the political environment that we see in the U.S. over here, and our experience working with within the U.S. space, pushing for mandatory climate risk disclosure rules. So one of it is obviously the vested interest that we see, being that as we've seen at the SEC, there is a lot of pushback against Scope 3 emissions disclosures, and a lot of it is coming, and a lot of the arguments over there are that this is going to place unnecessary burdens on small and mid-sized farmers in the U.S. And where we think that is unfounded only because, the SEC makes it very clear that disclosure needs to come from public companies and that they don't need to be going to every single small-scale farm or small farmer to get those emissions reporting, that they can calculate it, based on information that is available from third-party sources. And not only that they have safe harbor protections in place, and obviously considering that they've done their best to not omit data. The other place where we see hurdles is coming from the pushback right now that you're seeing, the backlash against ESG in general that is coming from Republicans. And we're really worried about how this could impact, especially in a divided Congress. You see the case of the SEC, the Chair Gensler has been dragged into Congress to to sort of talk about his position, the SEC's positions on certain ESG disclosures, especially climate. Yesterday, there was a hearing where he was bombarded about this. So we're really worried about how this could derail the process or delay it. We also saw this in terms of the DOL rule that came out on ESG, where it was vetoed by Congress, but it was passed by Congress, but then vetoed by Biden. So we are seeing the pushback. And the third thing we also hear is that now that the budget is in session, or there are conversations about the budget, is that the SEC's budget could be reduced by as much as 30%. Another place where we're concerned is also the legal challenges that the rule could place. I mean, there's already conversation everywhere about how companies or other trade groups are possibly going to legally challenge this in court. And obviously, as I mentioned before, with a very conservative majority in the Supreme Court, what is the likelihood that this rule will be implemented? Another thing that we see as a big hurdle is also the gap between public and private company reporting. Right now, all of the attention is on public companies, but as we know that in this market, especially in the US, there are lesser and lesser IPOs every year, and private companies are really, really big, and there's not a lot of disclosure on them. And also, as we see, one of the other risks that we see is also what we call brown spinning, which I'm sure you're aware of, is that publicly listed companies are basically selling off carbon-intensive assets to private companies. So there's really a question of how much of emissions reduction overall is there in the economy if that continues to happen. So I think for one of the reasons we think that the risk disclosure should be mandatory is because companies are not going to be doing anything unless we really force their hand to do that. And we see that right now with all these voluntary disclosures out there, companies are not reporting the information that is necessary to make assessments. So for example, with the TCFD, this big voluntary risk disclosure initiative that came out, companies are barely reporting anything. And if they are reporting, it's a lot of it has been rejuggled to shift and, to basically align with the TCFD recommendations. Even Carbon Tracker came out with a similar report saying that companies are not just disclosing enough. I think their universe consisted of the Climate Action 100 Plus's entire company list, and they said that most of these companies are not providing any information about climate risk disclosures in their financial statements. Another reason we think companies should be mandated to provide such disclosures is because right now they're cherry picking disclosures. So there's really no basis for comparison across companies in a sector and across industries, and really doesn't allow anyone to make any assessments of where we are in terms of reaching a 1.5 degrees C world. Or I don't even know if 1.5 degrees C is valid anymore, because there's so many different questions of that, but like transitioning to a cleaner future. And thirdly is that these disclosures should be mandatory is because climate risks are just so evident. I mean, we're seeing like almost every company has some form of stranded asset risk across its, across its portfolio. And this is going to be more and more evident over time. The economy is going to be affected. It's going to reverberate across sectors. It's going to have macroeconomic impacts that just hits health, migration, other aspects of the economy that are going to just affect everyone across the globe. I mean, we saw that with the COVID pandemic. And one of the big reasons I think in the US we see is that climate risk disclosure should be mandatory is because it's not that is not coming only from civil society. It's not only coming from the public. It's not only coming from climate activists. It's also coming from investors, not only small investors, but also large investors that are challenging companies because, climate risks are just so evident across their investment portfolios. I think one of the things is it'll help us identify gaps. These disclosures can help us know where we are, where we want to be, and how do we get there. So we have this thing where we've noticed, especially doing a lot of scorecards at Oxfam, is what is measured is always managed. And we're hoping that if it is not managed properly, then there are enough stakeholders, as I mentioned earlier, that can act as an amplifier, an advocate. to really call out bad practices or to really call out poor performance to get companies to where they are in terms of, transitioning to a cleaner future, in terms of advocating for more climate finance. Risk disclosures can also help companies and governments, prepare for a clean energy future. Risk disclosures can help us know, companies know how they're performing, where they are, for governments to know how much they can push, what do they need to monitor, and for stakeholders, to other stakeholders in that game, to be the levers also to push and drive for change. So in terms of why these risk disclosures are important for a clean energy future is because all that information is out there to see how companies are acting in the ecosystem and how to get them to where we want to move. The various stakeholders involved in this process could be workers, could be suppliers, it could be frontline communities and indigenous people. It could, again, also be investors, and also we consider the government as a stakeholder in the entire ecosystem. So, for example, if I were to talk about connectors, stakeholders as connectors and what role they play as a connector. So, for example, there are a lot of frontline communities on the ground that are impacted by the actions of companies. They don't necessarily have a voice on the global stage, but as civil society organizations can act as that connector, bringing the voices of those communities on the ground in these global spaces to really amplify their concerns, to really talk about the impacts, because as we've seen, across different projects, especially as you're seeing in mining companies and oil and gas companies and agricultural companies, a lot of frontline communities are sometimes not happy with the way companies come into their immediate environment and they really operate. And sometimes that leads to operational risks, delays. It's also led to change in laws in certain cases. And so really, how do we not only sort of act as that connector to reduce the risk to the companies, but also, more importantly for us, is amplify their voices, talk about the impacts to the people that are happening, to really sort of change the way or reform the way businesses operate in those environments.